And thank you all for joining us on this cold winter morning. Before we begin, may I request you to please switch off your phones. And I request the speakers to please come on stage. Thank you. I request Mr. Ravi Singh to please begin the session.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for, as Samad says, thank you for being here on a relatively cold February morning. We, as you are aware, many of you have been to such dialogues before, that the Ananta Aspen Center conducts several sessions on issues that are important for society, and I'll talk a bit more about that. We have the honor and the pleasure to welcome Mr. Konrad Meyer, Chairman of the Board of the Blacksmith Institute, and Mr. Richard Fuller, President of the Blacksmith Institute, both of whom have interest in this area in the region. Mr. Richard Fuller was here in 2010 in this very room. We had a similar session on working on issues relating to toxics and a conversation around that. Our Minister for Environment and Forests at that time, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, was present. Some of you were also there. I also take the honor of welcoming Mr. Tarun Das, who brings us all together in these kind of dialogues. And I see that Kiran hasn't come yet, Kiran Pasicha, who helps us in this work as well. I think both of them were delayed in the traffic. I would, the way we do this today is that I make some opening remarks. I'll introduce the speakers. Mr. Richard Fuller will make a presentation for approximately about 25 minutes. We'll discuss a few comments and we'll open up the conversation to the audience. Let me start by introducing Mr. Konrad Meyer, who during his 25-year career on Wall Street was a founding member of Lehman Brothers Mergers and Acquisitions Department. He went on to join Morgan Stanley and later Gleacher Partners. In these positions, Mr. Meyer advised a diverse array of companies on the conception and execution of billions of dollars in mergers, acquisitions, and financings. In his retirement, Mr. Meyer is an advisory partner with Nassau Point Investors, a private equity firm. He is also the vice chairman of the board of the American Red Cross in Greater New York. He's an undergraduate from Trinity College and a student of the London School of Economics. He has an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he's currently the chairman of the board of the Blacksmith Institute. Mr. Richard Fuller is an engineer from Melbourne University, and he's worked, much to my great pleasure and honor to be here with him. He worked for some time on the rainforests of Brazil with the UNEP program, where he created forest reserves, promoting the preservation of both rainforests and its inhabitants. So when he talks about toxics, I think many of us are on the same plane because we know the differences between ecosystems and between one and the other. He established in New York City the Great Forest Incorporated, now one of the most successful sustainability consulting companies in the United States. Great Forest was one of the first to bring sustainability practices to the business world, helping to pave the way for the rise of corporate social responsibility. Mr. Fuller founded the not-for-profit Blacksmith Institute in 1999. On a global scale, Mr. Fuller believes that pollution is still one of the most serious problems the earth faces, and developing countries bear the brunt of it. He was talking to me a little earlier, and actually the extent of which that where we are missing the picture, I think is more important than the picture that we know. Behind his determination Mr. Fuller's behind his determination is the know-how to solve these problems and saves lives at risk. I have been through one of his presentations, and I can commend the fact that we are going to be looking at something pretty, which is going to leave an impression on us. And hopefully we can drive ourselves to action to clean up what are the most important aspects of our country's toxic areas. This dialogue, I'm merely the moderator. It's usually because of the fact that I'm based in this building that I get the honor to do these kind of things. This dialogue is actually initiated by the Ananta Aspen Center, as I mentioned earlier. And this is formally the Aspen Institute, which is a non-profit organization which focuses on leadership development and encourages frank and open dialogue. These are several times on critical issues involving India and the region, including the environment. In addition, the center regularly holds discussions on key foreign policy issues, as well as security and strategic affairs. I would now welcome Mr. Fuller, request him to make a presentation, and then we'd have some remarks from Mr. Maya as well. Over to you.
Thank you kindly, Ravi, and thank you for having us here. Let me see if our technology will work. Marvelous. So thank you all for coming. It's always very empowering to see people, especially leaders in industry and business, come along and hear about these issues. We are deeply concerned about this matter around the world and have been working for a decade here in India, and are very grateful to see a slow groundswell with some productive results beginning to happen here in the country. So allow me to spend a little bit of time in talking about where the country is with respect to toxic exposures and where the country we think could go to deal with this particular problem. And as you know, our issue is being concerned with toxic pollution that affects human health, especially children. And there are too many places around the world like this where kids are in the forefront of breathing in toxic fumes, playing in soil that's contaminated with materials that will end up reducing their lifespan or even kill them in abrupt fashions, and drinking water that will give them cancers or other kinds of diseases. In fact, the scope of the problem we now know is significant. Globally, it's over 200 million people. In India, we think that number is around 20 million people who are exposed to toxins that we know cause damage to health at levels that are dangerous, levels that exceed the standards by a factor of 2, 3, or 4. 20 million people in India at least. And I want to tell you where these toxins are, what sort of toxins there are, and who's responsible. Because one of the key messages I really want you to go home with is, this is not a large corporate problem. The big companies, the US multinationals and the large organizations here are rarely implicated in these issues. Instead, it's a problem of small or artisanal or abandoned sites. And I'll show you some of that in quite some detail. What happens to kids when they're exposed to toxins is a multiplicity of different effects depending on the toxin. Lead will reduce their IQ. We see cancer rates increase from exposure to chromium, which happens around tannery sites. Radionuclides will cause cancers as well. Violence rates increase. Lead and mercury both will change the brain patterns enough so that you find a more violent society as a result. Pesticides, as you know, can cause cancers, diseases, all kinds of other things. Let me show you some pictures and examples of these things exposing Indian citizenry. Here's a place in Tamil Nadu, a factory that's abandoned, and this yellow stuff, if you ever happen to be wandering along the street and you see a stream that looks that color, don't go near it. It's acutely toxic. It's hexavalent chromium, and this is testing 780 times above international standards and going into the groundwater from where it's slowly progressing to the water supply of Chennai. And within a matter of several years, this will be in Chennai's drinking water. There is a plan, though, to fix this, I'm very happy to say. But this is what hexavalent chromium does to you when you spray it on your skin. When you drink it, of course, the same thing happens into your gastrointestinal tract, and increases in cancers and GI diseases are prevalent. It reduces life expectancy by many decades. Similarly here, exposure on the skin. To take another toxin, asbestos, we find that again throughout India. There are both mines and processing facilities here. This is an abandoned mine in Jharkhand. This white hill here is in fact crystallite asbestos, and the kids use this as a sledding hill. Of course, when you go into the town, you'll find incidences of mesothelioma cancers, these lung cancers that occur at astronomical rates, and the life expectancy in that town is 2 decades lower than the average. Anywhere near industrial estates, there are dump sites like this with kids playing around them. This particular one, organic pollutants were extremely high, lead was extremely high, and they're generally places that squatter settlements will live around because they're abandoned lands. So as there's an urban growth, the poor people will end up squatting on these lands, and it's the poorest that are affected here. This is absolutely an issue of poverty. The wealthy are much less affected than the poorest. These kids are playing in an effluent stream that people will dump waste into it, especially at night when no one can see it. We measured mercury in this effluent stream at 2,500 times the safe standard. This is an illegal battery recycling operation, and the white gray kind of shape you can see to the soil here is from lead. That lead, as soon as there's a bit of wind, will spread through the environment and poison the children all around it for decades to come unless it's cleaned up. And there are hundreds of places like this through all the urban areas of India. So when you add up all these bits and pieces, this is a problem of scale. Sure, each of these individual spots is maybe 500 people affected or 2,000 people affected or so on. But when you add it up, this is a quote from New York Times recently, the size of this is significant. In fact, if you include air pollution as well, this is about the same scale as air pollution, the toxic exposures. This is the World Bank's estimate, $80 billion cost and 23% of national child mortality from these particular issues. We've tried to analyze this problem in detail with proper WHO rigor to be able to determine the extent of the burden of disease. One of the things that Blacksmith has been busy doing is inventorying these toxic hotspots and identifying them, conducting a site assessment using internationally approved standards and methodologies, and then putting all of that into databases that are used by countries to help them to solve those problems, but also used by researchers to work out the extent, summing up all of these particular toxic exposures. And a study came out last year of looking at 3 countries together, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and looked at the burden of disease from these toxic exposures, and found that it is at least as large as that of malaria or outdoor air pollution. So we already know the burden that outdoor air pollution causes and malaria. Here we have something that is generally much less known, but just as significant. And I want to also point out that the study only counted 120 sites in India in the analysis. Clearly, that's a gross understatement. Even our own database, which has about 415 sites in it, is an understatement. We simply stopped counting when we ran out of money to do the evaluations. There are many, many more sites than that. So let's just let these folk come in and grab some seats. And I'm glad to see so many people come along. We're bringing some more chairs in. Welcome. Traffic is terrible out there in Delhi. So here we are, a problem of significance and scale. Let me tell you a little bit about our institute and what we're doing. We're based in New York, but active in 49 countries around the world. And India is one of our central hubs, if you like. Here from India, we're looking after our work in other countries as well. Our purpose in life is to implement programs that remediate these issues, that fix these exposures for children. And to date, we've done 76 projects, cleaning up a lead battery contaminated site, fixing groundwater exposure from hexavalent chromium, dealing with mercury, dealing with pesticides, all around the world. Our main focus is actually implementing these projects, especially implementing them in such a way so that governments can then replicate that effort, or industry can go in and replicate that effort. As well, we conduct this inventory work, and so far there's more than 3,000 sites in that database, all of them prioritized by impact. Ones that have higher public health impact are ones we feel people should work on earlier. And finally, we've also initiated a group called the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, which have members that include the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the European Union, UNDP, UNIDO, and so on and so forth, and many countries, including Mexico, Peru, Philippines, Senegal, so on. India's been invited. We're still waiting to hear if India wants to join. And this group's purpose is to initiate and begin work on these toxic exposures and mitigate these problems for local kids. In India, we've been active since 2003, for over a decade. We're ably coordinated by Pramila Sharma, who's in the back. Pramila Desai, sorry. And we've been doing a lot of inventory and pilot projects over the time. We're registered here, obviously, as a local organization. And we do this work on a collaborative basis. We're not an advocacy group. Instead, we like to find and implement solutions that deal with these issues, rather than make noise and attention. There are good groups doing that already. We see what's lacking is actual work on the ground with shovels, solving these problems and implementing them at scale. So this is a country that we see as also an example of how middle-income countries can move forward in this area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and Mr. Meyer will do so as well. Let me step back a second now and talk about India and what's going on here in terms of toxic exposures. There are some good things here that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years. The World Bank has been asked to provide monies to do some cleanups. 4 cleanups have been implemented in West Bengal and AP. And as well, the Clean Energy Fund, the coal cess, has been allowed to be tapped for remediation efforts of toxic sites as well. And CPCB, MOEF and CPCB have initiated the design phase of 10 highly contaminated sites. The database that we put together is now integrated into CPCB's own efforts. And this is a starting point that the government has taken some initiative in that we're very pleased to see, but it's clearly the very, very beginning and first steps. And I can show you that graphically in a second by talking through what are the key issues here in the country and where are they. And I can show you some of this in a second, but here are the toxins that cause the most problem. First of all, chromium. It affects 2.6 million people, and acutely, in other words, the toxin is at very high levels above standards. Almost half of that number of people are exposed at very dangerous levels. Lead has a total exposed population of 1.25 million people. And this is just in our database, which, by the way, we think is only scratching the surface of it all. Similarly, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and so on are all toxins that are of concern. And if you let me show you these here. Here is a map of all of those toxic sites, all 400 or so. And key to note is that they're all over. Clearly there's a spread in the industrial and mining sectors, but you find them in any urban center as well. You'll find toxic sites in any urban center as well. If I look to show you just the chromium sites, for example, here they are around Chennai in Tamil Nadu and obviously in UP. Lead sites, and again, this is still probably only 10 or 20% of the actual total number of these sites throughout India. Lead contamination comes from either battery recycling or e-waste, and occasionally from large industry and dump sites as well. The lead from batteries generally comes from the informal sector or the poorly managed formal sector. Batteries in the informal sector are broken open in backyards, and the guts inside are then melted or crudely smelted with open fumes going into the air. And they'll recover only about 60% of the lead out of the battery. And the rest of it is then discarded or left going out in fumes into the environment and poisoning local kids. In e-waste, lead comes from that CRT. The biggest exposure in e-waste is from the lead in the cathode ray tube. So old televisions and old screens from computers have a great amount of lead in them, and they will smash these tubes, mostly to get that copper piece that's at the end, the one that's been directing the electrons to make the screen work. But when they smash the tube, all of that leaded glass is generally just abandoned and left dusting through the environment, and you'll end up with very high lead exposures in places where that's been happening. So again, I can show you here are mercury in blue, mercury locations generally coming from industry, and so on and so forth. Here are the locations that are currently part of the CPCB effort. So if I show you those against the entire, at least in our database, toxic set of exposures, you can see that we've got a long way to go here, moving forward. So taking that database and breaking it down in a couple of different ways. One is by type of industry, by the actual modality of industry. The point to observe here is that it's all different industries have these toxic exposures. The blue at the top is mine and ore, chemical manufacturing, smelting, tanneries, agriculture, mixed industrial estates, heavy industry, some naturally occurring, pesticides, product manufacturing, and the like. There is no one specific industry that bears the brunt of this. However, when we cut it in a different way, by looking at it in terms of the size of the corporation involved, it's not the big guys. In that database of 3,500 sites, there is only 1 or 2 sites that have any implication of a large Fortune 500 company. Instead, 28% of the sites are abandoned waste dumps. 34% are backyard activities, like this battery recycling or e-waste or electroplating done in the backyard. And 31% are very small local concerns that are inadequately regulated and not safe at all. So if we're going to work on this issue, there's the capacity for the large corporate interests here to bring some of their expertise into that smaller and artisanal activity and bring them up to scale. It's obviously in their best interest to do so as well, so we'd like to see more of that happen. If I look at the current CPCB programs, the focus there is on hexavalent chromium, which is a good thing to do because there's so much of the tannery industry here in India. It's an obvious good start. There's a little bit of work they're planning on doing in pesticides and mercury, but there's nothing here on lead, and lead is a significant contributor. And I'd like to talk a little bit about lead as a specific toxicant of concern, because it's something I think that we can all begin to focus on a little better, especially given that industry has such a strong support to deal with this issue broadly. There's great representation here from both the international lead industry with ILMC, here Brian Wilson is here, and the Indian Lead Association. Mr. Pug is here as well. Great interest in dealing with this issue overall. So in our database, we're looking at about 100 sites that have lead contamination at dangerous levels. And about half of them are simply contaminated areas from artisanal backyard informal smelters that have since moved on, some e-waste as well. And these are simple cleanups. They can be done under that Clean Energy Fund. This material needs to be removed, the site needs to be made safe. About the other half of the site are from active, sometimes formal and sometimes informal recyclers who are not implementing safe systems. And they have either the ability to increase their compliance or potentially need to stop their operations. And lead is a especially bad toxicant. It's one of the most problematic ones of that which we care about. It causes, at quite low levels, a reduction in IQ. In fact, overall, across the globe, IQ has been rising in the past several decades because of the phase-out of lead in gasoline. That's happened progressively since the 1970s. And it has single-handedly been responsible both for increasing our average intelligence and reducing the amount of violence in society. There's quite good statistics that show a link between violent behavior and lead exposure. Lead also increases cardiovascular risk. It affects people later in life. And it has a link to schizophrenia, schizophrenic behavior and lead exposure. It's a neurotoxin, is a serious concern. And I always like to show this one chart over here. This is a demonstration of what lead does to large populations. And if you look at this, this is an IQ chart of 100 million people, just as a sample. All of them gathered around 100 points. That's the average IQ traditionally. Now, of that 100 million people, 6 million of them have an IQ above 130. These are the gifted people. These are going to be the artists, the leaders, the entrepreneurs in that society. So out of 100 million, 6 million are gifted. And 6 million are at the other end of the scale. They're intellectually impaired, and they're going to be costs to the state. They're going to be people we're going to need to look after. Now, if you expose that population to quite a low average level of lead, that entire chart shifts just a little bit to the left. And here it is, just shifted 5 points to the left, equivalent to an exposure to lead of only, only 10 micrograms per deciliter. That takes this 6 million and drops it down to 2.4 million people. You've decimated the intellectual capacity of the country. with lead exposure. And worse, you've taken the number of people who are mentally impaired and increased them from 6 million to 9.5 million. So you've added a burden on society that's significant. This is what's happening in any town that has significant lead exposure in India and all around the world. It's happening from places like this, dirty smelter. It's licensed, but it's polluting like crazy because across the street is a schoolyard just 50 meters away where the lead levels are off the charts. So here's an example of an industry that we should focus on. We can deal with it, we can clean up these toxic issues and solve them. And there's a simple, reasonably simple strategy for it. First thing we need to do is we need to slow down the worst polluters, the informal sector. This can be done by using some regulatory and economic mechanisms. And we're really thrilled that Dr. Gup from University of Delhi is beginning to look at those mechanisms and present these to the government for some implementation processes. And as well, that formal sector, the guys that are in business and licensed but doing a bad job, they need to bring their standards up. And that work obviously has a strategy that can move forward as well. And then finally, these legacy sites left behind need to be cleaned up. So this three-step process is a sensible one. So let me bring you three separate things that we see could happen. One is working on a particular industry like this. But similarly, this can be done and coordinated with industry in other areas as well. And industry has a vested interest in seeing these toxic sites be dealt with. And we'd like to see big business, the cleaner guys, begin to bring some resources and attention into solving the issues of the informal and the poorly managed sector as well. These integrated solutions can drive better results for the community. This can be done through industry associations, as we're seeing is happening with the lead industry. There's a need then to have some accountability in all of this. There needs to be a plan, an implementation process going on that's coordinating both government and industry efforts, and especially that's focusing on public health, not politics. We don't want to see cleanups go on where someone's brother-in-law's land dealt with before a place that's contaminating 20,000 people gets dealt with. So there's a need to have an accountability and transparency of these processes going forward. And especially, we want to see a focus on projects, actually doing physical, real things, and not just writing reports or advocacy or the like. Because I think if we do that, there's a chance of really dealing with this issue once and for all, with this simple, clear policy that chemicals and wastes will not be a burden on the health of local populations, especially children. Bringing in the private sector, continuing with these government projects and expanding them, with lead perhaps as a key priority, and bringing in some monitoring and accountability strategies here. I think we can leave this country to be a lot safer for the people that really matter, the youth that we're all looking to see help make this country the great success that it deserves to be. So with that, I thank you kindly, and we'll turn the floor back to our esteemed colleagues.
I request that those of you, especially the youngsters who came in late, now you missed the first part of the presentation. You've got to have a separate side session with Mr. Fuller. At least take you through the first 6 slides.
There'll be a test.
And then you talk.
Sure. Thank you all for coming this morning. I assure you, actually, my remarks will be less extensive than Richard's, and I have what I hope is a final upbeat focus to our comments. Before I come to that, I'd really like to make sure that I take this opportunity to thank a number of the people that have made this presentation possible. Ravi Singh is acting as our host, and WWF, and Tarun Datz, and also the Aspen Institute. This is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, so we welcome any chance that we have to address a group and bring this topic more to the fore in people's minds. My goal this afternoon is fairly simple. I'd like to go back actually over a number of the facts that Richard raised initially to give you a perspective on the toxic pollution problem from a global perspective. And really to do this with the hope of putting the issue here in India in context. I've been the chairman of Blacksmith now for 2 years and have been involved in the board for a number of years before that. My career has been largely in finance, so I'm not a scientist, but I've had a long interest in the environment and human well-being, and those interests fit well with what we do. And it's really from this vantage point that I've had an opportunity to watch as the extent of the toxic pollution problem on a global basis has become more apparent. Richard shared with you, I think, some of the statistics that have come from our toxic site identification program. Something that if you're around for long enough, you will never hear those words again. It will always be TSIP. And with our partners, we have been able to identify, as Richard pointed out, over 3,000 sites globally where there are substantial toxic pollution issues. And those sites impact relatively directly over 200 million people. And obviously then, in that respect, this is a very large problem. The numbers that we've talked about here in India are obviously significant, but they're only a fraction of that overall problem that we've talked about. And I would also say that to the degree that we've worked diligently on our program, we really still have identified only a fraction of the number of sites and the number of people that have been affected on a global basis. So this is a very large problem. I think, as you also noted, when Richard was reviewing some of the issues that exist here in India, in our work with a lot of different organizations, whether it's the United Nations, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, numerous national and local level governments, there have been some real patterns that have emerged as to where these toxic pollution problems occur. And it's not always in the places that a layman would expect. Richard's talked a lot about lead and the battery industry, your car battery, as a source of lead problems, also as a byproduct of mining. We've talked a lot about mercury, and interestingly, a lot of the mercury problems come from gold mining, small-scale gold mining. Chromium, Richard's talked about, that's a big issue here. Pesticide spills, typically just from poor storage of the pesticides, and more generally, poorly managed industrial sites and industrial dump sites. Again, on a global basis, located largely in poor neighborhoods. And I think the key here is that these are problems in virtually every developing country, and in the developed world as well, but particularly in the developing world. And just to give a couple of examples of this, I was recently spent some time with the Blacksmith folks in Tanzania and was talking with them about some of the problems that they faced. They have problems too. What we do find is that almost all of these problems that I've listed exist in every country, but the balance of the problems shifts from country to country. So in Tanzania, in the western part of the country, there's a lot of artisanal gold mining. These are individuals out virtually literally panning for gold and then purifying the gold using raw mercury with all the problems that you'd expect that come from that. That is not such, artisanal gold mining is not a big issue in India, but here in its place, you could select any number of problems. We've talked a lot about chromium and tanneries. That's a bigger issue here than it is in Tanzania. But again, it's all part of the list. By the same token, I was lucky enough to spend some time last week in Jaipur, where we were visiting with lead acid battery recycling company and seeing some of their relatively innovative recycling facilities, and also conducting a conference to talk with local individuals and companies involved in the lead business. And as I sat there, I began to think about it, and we, as Blacksmith, have done projects with lead acid battery recycling in the Philippines. We've obviously talked about it here in India as I go around the world. We've done projects in Senegal. We've done projects in the Dominican Republic and the Caribbean, literally forming a ring around the world in just this one problem. So this is a large problem. It's a global problem. It's an issue here, but it's an issue everywhere. You're part of good company, I suppose, is the way of looking at that. Now, if it is a big problem, what does really change from country to country is how much is being done about the problem. And here is where I think like to deliver what I think is the good news. And the good news is that India really has shined in the start that it has taken to deal with this problem. I think if you've seen from some of the things that Richard has discussed, India is one of the few countries that has taken affirmative steps to start dealing with toxic pollution. And this is something that is remarkable, and I think that you should be rightfully proud of. There's both a will and a way here, the way being the beginning of some governmental funds being allocated to dealing with this problem. This is not something that we have seen in as many other areas as we would like. And I guess from our perspective, in dealing with 50 different countries, India really stands out. As we would say, it's a sight for sore eyes in a world looking for direction in this area. So with that simple message, I guess we have another message that we would like to deliver. Given where India is and the esteem in which India is held in the developing world, we would like to see India become a role model for dealing with toxic pollution. You are and will continue to be developing skill sets here, both in the public and the private sector, for dealing with toxic pollution. And we would like to ask you to begin to share some of these processes with other countries. On a regional basis, certainly, but I think there's room even to do this, on a global basis, showing other countries in economic transition how to do this, and maybe even moving to the next step of helping some of the countries that are several steps behind you with direct implementation of some of the solutions to this problem. The structures that you're developing here really need to spread to the rest of the world. And I think this is an area where the world needs and could use India's leadership. We really hope that you will oblige them in this request. So with that challenge, in closing, I said I'd be brief. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to talk about what we view as being a really serious public health problem. And we look forward to seeing all of you more in the future. And we hope that we're going to have a chance to work with at least some of you, if not all of you, on dealing with this problem that's of grave concern to us and we feel should be of concern to you all as well.
Since you are in WWF and since I represent in a small manner my organization, I was not by saying. And when we're talking about toxics, I would say that some years ago, WWF was led by a strategy which is called targeted programs. It's in September. one of those target driven programs is toxics. And it followed very similar to the alliance that was shown on the presentation by Mr. Fuller. And the reason that we could not globally take it on was that our work on ecosystems really required us to work more on areas like water and soil. On natural systems, and therefore the program has now been subserved into these sectors from where it was focused finally on toxics. But while we were working on that, I can share two examples or some examples with you. Firstly, that you would have noticed in the last 20 years the skies of Delhi have been cleared out. There are no vultures that you can see here. And those vultures, one of the main reasons for the decimation, 96% decline in one species, 97% decline in the other. There's the white-backed vulture in this, and the slim-billed vulture. And the reason is directly related, according to scientific theory currently, to a chemical called diclofenac, which, by the way, is also used by all of you when you have body pain or inflammation of any kind, in a sports injury, or even when you strain yourself, climbing the stairs or whatever. So that's in our pharmaceutical stuff at this point of time. And that's what's directly killed the vultures, because their physiognomy could not take the toxicity, number one. Number two, when I was talking in 2010 about some of the experiences we've been through, we talked about the emergency in 2007 when we lost 112 gharial in the Chambal. And that's directly related to, according to the veterinarian tests, to chemicals in their blood systems, including lead and heavy metals. Where that came from, how it happened, how it struck only the gharial, that is something that's never been really found, but this was a direct result. Incident in my daughter's school where they went to a minister, water minister then, it wasn't the Aam Aadmi Party, by the way, and they went and said to the minister that your water purification plant is pumping out this kind of stuff. We've tested it, it's not good, but here's a glass of water, it's absolutely clean, it comes from your thing, why don't you drink it? Because you're making us drink it. And the minister refused. He didn't drink the water. So, I mean, these are incidents that somehow relate to some of the issues that even the children are bringing up to us. And this is one of those things that now schools actually visit. In our time, schools used to go and see monuments, and they used to look at, sometimes go to parliament, sometimes, go to museums. Now children are taken to places like Ghazipur to show them the new monument that India is putting up. I don't know if you know Ghazipur, some of you who may not, but it's a very large garbage pile up. Maybe you've been there or you have seen it. And you can see it from the air, and it's about as tall as the Humayun's tomb, which is more or less opposite Ghazipur itself. We have the incident, we work in the Tarai, and we worked on something called the Living Ganga program, and currently the phase 2 of the program looks at a tributary called the Ram Ganga, which starts, it's about 700 miles of river, not very well known in India, but it starts from the glaciers up in Uttarakhand and goes all the way and meets up with the Ganga somewhere in Uttar Pradesh. And along this is the habitat which is known as the Corbett Tiger Reserve. And in the Corbett landscape, a 15-year study has shown up that there's a species, it's rather a long name, it's called the Himalayan lesser gray-headed fishing eagle. Okay? It's a bird about this big, white tail, gray head. There are two varieties, the gray-headed and the lesser gray-headed. The lesser gray-headed fishing eagle has not bred successfully for the last 15 years. There are researchers who know the sites, they know the nests. It lays eggs, it protects them, but eggs are not hard enough to hatch. And when the toxicity studies were made on those, they found heavy metals and other pesticides in the shells, which are making this happen. Now, these are indicators, the gharial, the vulture, the lesser gray-headed fishing eagle. When I was reading your CV, from the financial, your financial career, a lot of it sounded very familiar to me because I come from a financial career too. And in my time, we had to go and see industries up in north of Bombay into Gujarat, and he passed Ankaleshwar at one point of time. And in Ankaleshwar, you know the yellow water that you saw? In Ankaleshwar, you can actually make a choice of what color of soil you want to see. So you want to see magenta, they'll take you to one particular part of the place. You want to see pink, you can go to this particular area. You want to see that, then you can go to this ward of the municipality. It was so bad. I mean, I'm talking about 12 or 15 years ago. WWF works in a district called Firozpur, where there is a confluence of the Beas and the Satluj, in a wetland called Harike. On this side is Amritsar district and Bhikivind. On the other side is the district of Firozpur. Firozpur, by the way, from the station, runs a train which is now popularly called the Cancer Express. Because there's no hospital in Firozpur, and it's probably at a point where all the chemicals are leached in Punjab, because that's the incline of the land. And people from Firozpur actually catch a train and go to Ganganagar in Rajasthan. And this has been covered in the press time and again, but it's because of the agricultural, the pesticide, the chemicals, all those things that have happened. And the worst part is the social fallout. You saw the intellectual, the intelligence part, the paradigm shifting, but society has different ways to respond to it, because people will not marry into that village in Punjab. Yeah, they would not send their daughters there, or they would not take girls into their village from there, because they say, "Un gharon mein bimari hoti hai." There's sickness in those houses. I mean, the session was held here when we were working on our water. This villager got up from Punjab and said these things in front of the press. So there are other social issues that are involved. You saw the photograph of Jharkhand, the one where the asbestos was falling off the hillside. Those of you who've been to Mandla a few years ago, you saw this site on the left-hand side going to Mandla from Jabalpur, time and again, till the government shut it down. Because somebody, some good civil servant actually saw this and said action needs to be taken. So it's not all negative, things are happening. But I think we need much more of that. At some stage in the future, we believe that biomaterials will be used in issues like construction. We may move away from metals as a complete dependency. And I think some of us have read stuff on this. You may have seen the film called Avatar, which actually talks about this sort of a theory. I mean, this is not just fiction, that this may actually happen. And if this happens, this might triple the size of the global economy. But at the same time, our dependence on metals will go down to some extent. But the toxicity in the soil will remain for centuries. And I'm talking to you as a historian, that in the 17th century, there was a traveler called Tavernier. He came to India. He was a jewel merchant. He came from France. And he left behind, I mean, he was dealing in gems and all that with Aurangzeb, Shah Jahan, and later Aurangzeb's side. And he more or less mapped the mineral map of India, particularly with regard to diamonds and jewelry and all that kind of stuff. And you may have heard the Kohinoor and, of course, the blue diamond and other things. Now, the alluvial metals that Mr. Fuller mentioned, Tavernier's map at that point of time shows it extensively all across India. Yeah, and that's not the point. The point is that since then, we've had casual mining of this kind of metals all across the country, especially in Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh. It still goes on. I've been to those places. I've been where government used to give out leases for small patches of land so people could look for gold and diamond on it. And they would be using, I mean, the land doesn't belong to them, so there's no maternal feeling towards the land. So they would leave it. They'll use it with the best chemicals they could get to extract. So you'd use cyanide and stuff like that, and then, you'd never get it out of this system. This has been happening for some time. So if we've got 400 sites, I can tell you we probably have much more than that. And we owe a responsibility to this earth, because this earth belongs to us and we are the custodians at this point of time. And across nations, this needs to be cleaned out. This is not just a sermonizing session. I think we need, my organization, as many others, Toxic Link and others, CSE, they work on these issues. Kamal Mittal says to me this morning that you guys don't work on air. Sure, we don't work on air yet, but once we start working, we will work. But meantime, there are other organizations that work on air, and they're doing good work on this. While that may not be our topic, but I must say that there is positive action happening and things do change if you start working. We see a couple of things I'll just share with you quickly because this is actually not what was part of the program. All across India, we see garbage tipping in the hills. So all garbage, all your hill stations, all the non-hill stations, all the kasbahs, there's no disposal of garbage. Garbage is tipped across the hillside. And over 60 years or so, it comes into the Ramganga and the areas around Darjeeling and all the other places that you know, and gets into the ecosystem, and then gets into us. I think many of us today have family, relatives, or friends who've been affected by these diseases. It's not just relating to the underprivileged. It's everywhere. And I think we owe this responsibility to national health. A few other points I'd just like to make. I think what WWF would state around this, there are two issues. One is the threat perception, which is urbanization, which large extent next 50 years. The shift in populations and the growth of our cities is going to create a big issue for us, and I think we better start looking at this. And the second is the issue of water stewardship amongst industry that we have a program on, as well as what we have been talking about, ecosystem services, whereby this responsibility needs to be transferred onto the costs of project or the cost to a city or an area so that they live a better life. I think there is a lot to be said here. Some of the areas that were pointed out, I'm sure we know more about this, all of us individually, in the great experience we have in the room. And with that, I'd like to stop, but I'd like to ask a few questions so that perhaps you could take that forward, and then we would move into the audience for conversation. And my first question is to you, Mr. Fuller. Can I request you to talk a bit about the fact that so far what you've been discussing is, to a large extent, on technology, to take the lead out and get processes and get people and industries and associations moving, pollution boards. And within this, is there a larger message with regard to social responsibility that we can take to our governments and the governments who respond on that side? Not just technology, but more than just that, responsibility of people and citizens to the areas that they are.
It's a complicated question to think on at that level. There is I think, an inherent requirement for us all to be dutiful to what we're doing to the world and to our communities. And I think we're seeing more of that show up in the corporate ethos that's going on around the world as well. In the last couple of decades, there's been a shift into responsible citizenry, especially with the larger companies, that has really literally made quite a difference in so many different places. We're also seeing more responsibility for people in their own choices of how their purchasing habits are moving forward. And these are all fabulous and powerful things moving forward. Where the disconnect happens, I think, is we're all happy to eat organic food and ask our at shareholders meetings for our companies to do well. But where the disconnect goes is moving from there into the issues that don't get seen and addressed, and bringing a stronger and broader understanding of these issues into that. So there's a development that needs to happen in that particular process. But it is present, and there is a renewed sense of responsibility in the generations that are moving forward. My son is at Brown University. There's nothing they do that doesn't have a green tinge to it, a green association, a green concern to it. So it's a matter of bringing real-world solutions into that identity, I think, that needs to go forward further.
Have you seen examples where, let's talk about the Indian subcontinent and the region. I think both of you gentlemen, if you could comment on some aspects of, you said, let's take leadership in this area. India has an option of taking leadership in this area. And where we've done this so far, and what more can we do?
sensitive issue. India has not shown much leadership in this area at a governmental level to date. I think it's a challenge out there. This political environment, it would be great to see the government here show more of a sense of leadership in this concern. It's perhaps something we should wait for a few months and see what shows up and see where the directions go, but I would love to set that as a challenge goal for the ministries to begin to take what is the beginnings of a success story and promote it, especially regionally. There's nothing happening in Bangladesh. There's nothing happening in Nepal. Nothing in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Indonesia is a step behind what's going on here, desperately needs assistance to work out how to manage some of these issues. Philippines also is stalling on all the rest of it. China is the one country that, like India, has begun the first steps in dealing with this. China has focused mostly on air quality and made some great gains there in urban air quality. Clearly not nearly enough, but at least some good gains, as Delhi did originally in bringing in CNG in their urban transportation sector. We would love to see some push, government taking this up and saying, let's begin to show and transfer these technologies and ideas and show that leadership. But let's wait and see.
I mean, Richard, I'd also add there are a couple of pieces. First, on the government side, there are two pieces to government encouragement for cleaning up toxic waste. One is passing the legislation. That's difficult. What sometimes gets overlooked and is even more difficult in many respects is actually enforcing the legislation. And I think that that's an area that, again, over time, everybody's going to want to watch because started to develop some technology for dealing with some of these issues. I don't suppose I need to go on record, but we were meeting with a company that focuses on the recycling of used lead-acid batteries, whose technology, if it could be more broadly spread in India and, quite frankly, outside of India, would really help to partially at least ameliorate the problems that we're seeing. And any assistance that the financial markets and the government and the like can help provide to those industries that are helping to deal with the problem, both here and abroad, because international trade is a very competitive environment. And whatever can be done to assist Indian companies in being able to export some of their technology would be helpful. So I'd say enforcement and maybe encouragement of the private sector when it is able to come up with solutions.
But the graph showed that the maximum amount of incidents or areas that you see in terms of sectoral is the smaller companies.
Yes.
The smaller companies, the small corporations, right, enterprises, and things like that. This, by the way, to large extent is the backbone of India in terms of industrialization, in terms of employment. And that is a challenge because public sector, large corporations, Indian corporations, multinationals will be able to take the action that is required. Now, would you be suggesting some actions by these associations or by these companies?
Yes, and it's a process. You have to look at this as not meaning to create some kind of a step that puts people out of business and disrupts economies. Instead, this needs to be seen as a gradual process of formalizing sectors, increasing their performance, creating some mechanisms where there are economic returns for improving their environmental performance to over time. So these incremental steps can be adopted as part of the regulatory and economic structures within the country, and just done in that process. I think there are examples of this happening already in India that need to be pushed one step further, and we'll always feel somewhat dissatisfied because there is always another step to go in this particular formalizing mechanisms. But at one point, we'll turn back and look and not see 20 million people whose lives are being shortened by a decade. And that will be a great sign.
Robbie, I think you raise a very important point here. A lot of this does come from single or small number of individuals working. Take the lead-acid battery case. These folks aren't out there swinging sledgehammers against car batteries and smelting the lead because they enjoy doing it. They're doing it because there's an economic imperative for them to do it. You do it or you don't have enough money to eat. So it is important. We can go in and clean up a problem, but if you don't deal with the underlying economic imperative that's driving people into the behavior that's creating the problem, you're just going to see it reemerge. And I know that we work hard when we look at a situation like this to get the local community involved, to get business, to get the government involved, to really try to proactively come up with solutions as to what people are going to do to replace the work that we may be displacing and that may be going to larger corporations.
You mean in terms of supply chain?
Well, in terms of making sure that there are alternate employment opportunities for the people who were in the industry that we may be removing because it was causing pollution.
I take some questions and comments from the audience because I still have one or two questions, but I'd defer to you, ma'am. Please take it.
Thank you, and especially focusing on children. I think inclusion of birth defects is also important.
Yes.
Because that's what gets missed. And also like with the endosulfan, what happened in Kerala and as you were mentioning in Punjab and all. The other thing is I was involved in the relief work in Bhopal. It's not just the gas, not the 370 tons in the campus, not the 1,000 tons which is lying in the pond, all covered up, right? All the toxic effluents, even today, I'm saying the which is seeping in the water. So the one, that concern that even till today, the children being born with birth defects, and there are problems still, you're aware of that. The other concern is that the toxic trade, because it was in Women Equality and Health about 10 years ago, there was a meeting, and from Papua New Guinea, the persons who had come had talked about jelly babies. I'd never heard of jelly babies. Like, the nuclear waste being dumped in the island and what it did to the... So I'm just saying, with some of these effluents and waste being traded as part of business, and in some of the trade agreements, it's not shown as waste, because that bustle and all that is supposed to cover. They're written as non-new goods. So some of these areas, because one is small people doing something, but there are certain things happening which are, not on the radar. One more thing I'd like to this segment, the access to unbiased information from any source. Because I have done my post-graduation medicine, I'm a public health physician. How much we are taught about this and the newer inputs that I need. Your things are very nice. I hope some of this would be available, but the health hazards of some of these things are known, but a large number are not known. Example, the intermediates. Like the methyl isocyanine, there were many there. The only antidote apparently was sodium thiosulfate, which is also the antidote for cyanide. And because it would have affected legal compensation issue, it was denied. And that information had been given by the medical director of the Union Carbide from US, the telex of which some of us had managed to get a copy. So the thing is that what are even the management and the prevention of these things, the whole public health dimension, because that's what you were mentioning, is so important, and appreciated your this thing about some of the things that are tackleable, but the toxic trade, I would
Thank you,
like your comments.
Thank you very much. I think non-biased information is... Sorry?
Okay.
She did, actually.
I'm Dr. Meera Shiva, and I'm from Initiative for Health and Equity in Society and associated with People's Health Movement and Third World Network also.
So non-biased information is a major issue with in civil society, I think, and the waste. Sir, and after that, ma'am, why don't you let him go?
I'm Arvinder Brara, Chairman and Managing Director of Mantech Consultants. I think the point which, Ravi, you raised about the municipal waste is of great concern all over in India. Because even in Delhi or Mumbai, leave alone these hill stations, the dumps of municipal waste, you have to hold a handkerchief to your nose when you're passing by. You see all kinds of vultures and all kinds of things. Some of that you still see, but the point is that if you see these municipal sites in California or other parts of the developed world, you see a garden. You see that they cover the thing with and make grass and flowers, and they generate gas to produce electricity. So what is a cost center becomes a productive center, which you don't see at all. And I, as a consultant, have been trying this for the last 5-10 years. We did some study in Ghaziabad, we tried to do it, but they listen, but no action happens. So my question is, can you please, with the help of Richard, make the municipalities in the country aware of what can be done to convert these municipal waste dump sites into something which is of beauty and of utility, and see that some accountability is put. There is no accountability. All they collect taxes, but they spend no money on areas of concern for environment. So accountability, weather legislation. So it's a question of cooperation in enabling the municipalities to learn how other municipalities are tackling this problem, and then enforcing accountability. Do you think this can be done?
Do you think it can be done?
I hope so.
So, okay, I have a different take to it. I'll be very brief. I don't think it will be done in our lifetime. I don't think so. If it has to be done, I think all of us in this room have to try many more times of our effort than what we are putting into this. It has been done in our lifetime in the past, I can tell you. There's an example, those of you who might know this city, there's a living example of exactly what Mr. Singh here said. And it's just on the opposite side of Ghazipur. Now, I don't know if you old Delhiites would remember this, but if you go from the ring road, from Pragati Maidan, if you turn right and you go towards to the Noida, that bridge, on the right, you go through a place which is now converted into a religious garden. There's a Buddha statue, there's a stupa and all that. And that is the gap between the ring road, where the Jamna used to flow, and the Purana Killa. It's about 1 kilometer on the right side. That, in my school days, was entirely a dump. It was a forest. It was cleared. It was made into a garbage dump. The garbage dump was covered. It was laid over with soil, and now it's a garden. Now, whether it's been properly done so the leaching doesn't happen into the ecosystem, that's a separate issue. The gardens that you're mentioning abroad in other have that kind of understanding. Does it leak gas? I hope not, because we are into climate change now, so I hope that's not a methane source. So, but the example exists in our very city, just on the other side. So all we need to do, of course, is also tell our municipalities, see the work that they themselves have done some years ago. That is the issue. Ma'am, there was a question, I'm sorry.
No, it's just fine. My name is Sharat Chandra, and I'm not talking of aesthetics, but nor am I addressing the corporate heads or anything. I just want to come to the other end, that is there any awareness done amongst those children who slide on that kind of dump you showed us? Or, I mean, the people, the rural people or the people who are not as educated as we happen to be know that they should not play with those things or should not go near that. We of course know and do take precaution, but what about the other end? Is there any awareness program being done? I'm not aware of it myself.
They need a good playground.
But they need, not only that, aesthetics is very far away, but the cleanliness and their own sense. Because if I throw something, suppose I mean, there are kids who come, okay, let's play with it. There has to be some awareness done amongst those people who do not know. Thank you.
I cannot expect them to answer the question whether the kids in
I
India
just have- I
are
just-
making it. But if you have some global examples, how would you like to?
I can talk certainly about projects where we've been implementing programs to do cleanup, and the community education piece is paramount. The first part of the design of doing any cleanup is to bring together all of the different stakeholders, including all those community organizations. And part of that process, aside from designing, how many truckloads and shovels and things you need, is to design a community education program so that kids know what to avoid and parents know what is going to be causing disease and what isn't, and implementing that along the way. So we know how to do it, but I don't think anything's happening in Jharkhand, for example. That's absolutely right. Yeah. There needs to those components are there. There is a basic regularized methodology of doing these projects that we've now kind of developed as a mechanism for different countries to adopt under the Global Alliance. And what we're looking to do country by country is bring that mechanism that includes this community component to the processes that countries will undertake step by step, be it done by industry or by government. That this is, you have to conclude all these components. Yeah.
Kamal.
My name is Kamal Mittal. I have a question for Mr. Fuller. You showed a map with little balloons of the various areas of pollution affecting particular areas of India. I wonder if you could do a map which does not have any of these spots. In other words, which are those areas which have no such issues, which you mentioned a list? Is there a map which can show that these are the good areas of India as they exist today, in your opinion? The reason I say this is, most people are driven by either greed or threat. As far as greed is concerned, if you turn it upside down, you would like to know which are those great areas which are good for going and living. And the real estate prices there would go up. So there'd be more connected people who would see to their interest that there are some areas which are more valuable than other areas. And threat, as far as threat is concerned, remember that in India after 9/11, 26/11 came up in Bombay, where the threat reached people sitting in this room or their experiences versus experiences in Jharkhand someplace or some remote place. And the threat to Parliament, for example, when the MPs experienced it. So now my thought process is that there is a bigger threat. There are about 8.5 million people affected with a lot of pollution in different ways, but you have nearly 20 million people in Delhi who are affected by bad air quality. In other words, I've been saying that Delhi is unfit for habitation between Diwali and Holi, which means November to March, where the PM 2.5s are beyond any expectation. The WHO standard is 50. In Lodhi gardens, they vary from 300 to 1,000. There are enough studies done relating PM 2.5s to out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. Now, this affects the Prime Minister, the President, all the members of Parliament and MLAs. It includes the Aam Aadmi Party and the BJP and the Congress and the works. So the question is, what are they aware of it? Are they doing anything about it? Or are we saying that, well, we've got to die one day, so it doesn't matter, we'll die one day anyway. So the question is, in China, they've realized that there is a problem and they're doing something about it. We have not even realized people who can do something about it are not concerned about doing it. Because you can clean up the air, but nobody's bothered. So the question is, once people start realizing threat to themselves and also opportunity to perhaps move out to some place in India which is not affected by all these issues, I think this two-part business in terms of threat and greed would drive a change. And that could work out. I would like you to comment.
I don't recommend you go there. Okay.
I don't know how to.
But do you want to venture?
Yeah. Well, I think one point is the air quality burden of disease is one of the most substantial problems in the pollution spectrum, and globally as well. And it's these toxic sites, in terms of the studies we've done, have a similar burden of disease to the air quality issues that show up. So, when you look at these analyses of what's killing people in different countries, these WHO studies that are produced with departments of health all over, they're only just beginning to put a line that says outdoor air, and they haven't even thought of putting in a line that says toxic sites. And that defines how the governments respond in terms of the health initiatives to a great extent. So part of what we all need to do is to get that data into these systems. So when we're looking to put money into basic hospital care, rather than preventative issues like cleaning up the air here, there's decisions that can be made appropriately. In terms of finding the cleanest places in India, let me know. We'll go visit.
Take a couple of questions or comments before we close. Because I have a question, but that can wait. Ma'am, just identify yourself.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Dr. Atri Ganguly from WHO India, country office. Well, we all agree.
From WHO?
Yes, WHO country office. Well, we all agree that, this question of this issue of pollution is a multi-sectoral issue. It is not only the health or the environment ministry who are only affected. There are other ministries like, the revenue generation, the industries, the agriculture. So, this presentation was wonderful. It was an eye-opener to all of us. My request to the speakers are there, examples of countries who are able to have a multi-sectoral coordination, or they have identified that hook or mechanism, how all these ministries, all these sectors, who are not only health and environment, but also those profit-making, like the industries will be interested only in making profit. They will not be so much interested in the health. So how to, include health in the mandate of these ministries, like the commerce, the agriculture? Are there examples from countries which have identified and worked, and so that it will be a ready-made recipe for our government and we can share it with our government?
Multi-sectoral examples in different...
I have a one that comes to mind. There are some countries that will hold gatherings regularly of all of these different government agencies and talk about their pollution issues. Mexico has a multi-sectoral group that has Ministry for Environment and Health and Industry and others sitting about every 3 months and talking about these issues. I must tell you, Mexico has done very little, though, in terms of actually implementing and solving issues. So even if there is a conversation, I'm always unsure if that's going to end up producing anything other than minutes to meetings. So we have to, really make sure that there is a focus on these physical projects as much as possible. I also think that there's often a hesitation to move into action about these issues because one can decide, is this more effective or that more effective, and which should we do first and all the rest of it. We should drill through that and barrage that aside as quickly as we can. Just to do something often opens the floodgates to do so many more things. And there's many country examples that we have where having done one pilot, it suddenly realizes, it enables people to realize they can actually do something and look after these issues. And replication then occurs and things really pick up dramatically. Just getting something done is really a critical thing. So then form the meetings and bring all the coordination together. But I'm a big fan of doing something.
Last question or comment? Sure.
Yes, of course. Blacksmithinstitute.org. Also, the yes, all of this. And also the Global Alliance's GAP, GAHP.net. And if you Google blacksmith, all these things will show up very quickly.
I can give you some, Ms. Nehru. I'll give you some. Sir.
Brian Wilson from the INC. Just a comment to the last question. Basically, one way to compare to that, and this is actually taken in Central America, Mexico, I agree with you. In Central America, for example, the lead plant, when it's an operating license, it has to obtain a license from the Ministry of the Environment and the Ministry of Health. It can't operate without having two licenses. That's not very clear.
So on behalf of the Ananta Aspen Institute, I would like to thank you, gentlemen, for this morning's discussions, and also the audience for the participation. I would encourage, there is time, we'd move out and have a cup of tea so that we could interact with the people, including all you youngsters who've been sitting shocked out of your thinking patterns as to what kind of world you're going to live in tomorrow. The 2 points I'd just like to make, that I've quite often in my career in WWF have been faced with the fact that for want of anything else, sometimes city leaders and city fathers say that we must have on an occasion like the Environment Day, we get kids out into the system, either into a part of a forest or a little part of the city, and get them to clean the garbage, pick up the garbage, put it into baskets or whatever, and take it out. And I've always asked at this kind of an event that why should our children be cleaning up the garbage? They're not the ones who created it. There's a generational problem. Yeah, I think the elders should clean the garbage and show to the children that this is how it should be done. It's not the other way around. Who are you trying to shame? So this is something, in this thing, getting something done, and we must know how that getting something done should be good in terms of technology, in terms of the right thing to do, and it should be morally correct as well for the earth that we have. And before I, bid this close, I would like you to leave you with one thought. A lot of us here are involved in the topic of climate change. Now, this is not directly involved in terms of climate change, but remember, on one aspect, climate change talks a lot about energy. The future, in a lot of it will be renewable energy. Renewable energy then leads to something called storage. Storage will be in batteries, or what? Now, if it's going to be in batteries and we start storing energy in batteries 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now, how are we going to dispose those batteries 60 years hence? Yeah? So let's bring the solution into the problem early on, rather than waiting for a day like this, when we have to see a presentation where Mr. Mittal has to ask, show me a place which is clean. So on that, think about this. Maybe you can discuss it later. Thank you very much for being here. And invite all of you to come out and please have tea with us. Thank you.